welcome to this month's Hoard's Dairyman webinar. This is Steve Larson, Managing Editor at the magazine, and I'm pleased to join Mike Hutchins, our co-host, and there at the University of Illinois. Mike here very shortly will be introducing our presenter for the day, Mike Allen at Michigan State, who will be talking about some HOT feeding strategies. But we appreciate very much all of you who are participating in the webinar today. Nice to have you along with us. And Mike, you can go right in.
Very good, Steve. Thanks much. And it's really my pleasure today to introduce one of the world-renowned speakers, Dr. Mike Allen, a good friend, professional and personal friend. Mike is the Distinguished Professor of Dairy Nutrition at Michigan State and joined that staff in 1987. You'll hear one of his primaries of research interests in the area of energy intake on dairy cows and effects at parturition. He also has done a lot of work on forage utilization, NDF utilization as well, and improving animal health at this point. He's co-authored and authored over 500 research reports and extension publications, and we're quite pleased, Mike, with the new Spartan 3 Dairy Ration Balancer. It's worked very well for us in classes at this point. Mike is no stranger for most of you online because he has presented over 200 invited talks around the United States, Canada, and foreign countries, and because of that was recognized with several prestigious awards from the American Dairy Science Association. So Steve, we're basically, Mike, we're extremely pleased to have you fit us into your very busy schedule, and we're excited with your topic here today that's going to be entitled Hot Feeding Strategies to Increase Production in Health. So we certainly welcome Dr. Mike Allen to the program, and it's yours to run, Mike.
Well, thank you, Mike and Steve. It's a pleasure to present this program today. And when we talk about hot feeding strategies, hot has another meaning other than current or recent. It stands for hepatic oxidation theory that we're going to hear. I'm going to be discussing. It's a theory of control of intake that I think it's important to know about. And today I'll be presenting a new approach to feeding and grouping cows based not only on requirements as previous methods have been, but also on metabolism and physiological response in regard to energy intake and partitioning. And I view energy intake and partitioning as kind of the holy grail of diet formulation. It's not something that that programs can really predict, but it's very important to production and health. So this approach considers concentration of forage fiber in diets, NDF digestibility, starch fermentability, allocation of forages on the farm, managing body condition score through lactation, and strategic use of byproducts. We incorporate topics that are very important to feed management. And for the overview of the presentation, I'm going to start by talking about control of feed intake. And of course, intake is limited by gut fill some of the times, but also it's limited by HOT. That's the hepatic oxidation. So HOT stands for hepatic oxidation theory, and basically it's that the pattern of fuel oxidation in the liver can affect feeding behavior and dry matter intake. I'm also going to be discussing control of energy partitioning. Just because the energy is consumed, we want to also be able to partition that to milk versus body condition, and we can do that by how we feed. It's important to understand the interaction of diet with physiological state, because cows vary tremendously in their physiological state over a lactation, from fresh cows to peak lactation to late lactation, and that determines really how we should feed them. And I'm going to finish by talking about feeding strategies feeding strategies and how they should change through lactation. Now, cows don't always understand models, even if you take the time to explain it to them. So today we'll cover some of the reasons why, and that is that models do a good job at predicting requirements, but not so much on animal response to the feeds that we feed. So there's 6 important points I'm going to cover that are important to know when we discuss feeding strategies. The first is that forage NDF is filling and can limit intake. The filling effect of forage NDF varies. Okay? I'll be discussing how it varies and what factors affect it. Gut fill limits feed intake more as milk yield increases. So a higher producing cow is going to be intake is going to be more limited by gut fill than a lower producing cow. Feed intake is also controlled by oxidation of fuels, and that's another major factor affecting feed intake besides gut fill. The fifth is that energy partitioning varies, and it varies through lactation, but it also varies depending upon how we feed the cow. And feeding strategy affects energy intake and partitioning. So I'm going to be discussing these 6 factors and show some research to support it, and before I start talking about feeding strategies. So the first is forage NDF is filling. Now, feed intake decreases with increased diet forage NDF concentration, and that can be shown in this graph. And what we have here is a bunch of lines, looks like spaghetti here, that each line is a different study reported in the literature where they substituted in forage for concentrate. And there was no, it's important to know that there's no byproduct, high fiber byproduct feeds here. There's no what we call non-forage fiber sources. Along the x-axis, we see we see NDF, which is really adjusted by changing forage NDF. And on the y-axis is dry matter intake. And what I want you to see here is that there's a very sharp decline in dry matter intake as we increase the forage NDF concentration of the diet. Okay. All right. So it's important to know that it's forage NDF that affects intake and not so much NDF in general, because when we substitute in non-forage fiber sources such as beet pulp or brewer's grains, they have relatively little effect on feed intake when substituted for concentrates. So when we increase the NDF content of the diet, and here we have non-forage fiber sources as a percent of the diet dry matter from 0 up to over 40%, we see very little effect on dry matter intake. Okay. So the next important point is that the filling effect of forage NDF varies. Okay? So there's great differences in the filling effect depending upon several different things. One is digestibility of the NDF. We know that NDF digestibility is highly variable. It's a very important forage quality parameter. And here we have data of corn silage. And this is data that we collected in 1988 and 1989 for corn silage, and 1990 and 1991 for alfalfa. You know, about good 20, 30 units difference in NDF digestibility. So we wanted to look to see how important that was to the animal. So, okay, so the first study we looked at, okay, there. We conducted a study. One of my grad students, Rick Dato, conducted a study and to look at the effect of in vitro NDF digestibility of alfalfa on dry matter intake and production. We had 2 alfalfa silages and formulated rations with the same forage NDF and total NDF with different NDF digestibility of these two alfalfas. So the dry matter of the alfalfas were the same, 33%. The NDFs were about the same, but we balanced the diet to the same forage NDF and total NDF. And NDF digestibility was about 1.9 units higher for the high compared to the low. And that resulted in about a kilogram more, or 2.2 pounds more dry matter intake, and also 1.9 kilos more, or over 4 pounds more milk yield. We then continued looking at fiber digestibility of corn silage, and we did that by looking at brown midrib corn silage compared to normal. And this is another of my students, Masahito Oba, who compared brown midrib corn silage, which is a low lignin mutation, compared to its near isogenic normal corn silage. That means the same hybrid without the brown midrib trait. And the brown midrib, we basically harvested both about the same dry matter. The brown midrib had a little bit lower NDF and quite a bit lower lignin, 40% lower lignin, and about the same protein, but about 9.7 units higher 30-hour in vitro NDF digestibility. And, okay, so that resulted in the brown midrib increasing dry matter intake by 2 kilos a day. This was fed to 32 lactating cows, I neglected to mention, but it increased dry matter intake overall 2 kilos a day, increased milk yield. Fat-corrected milk yield was increased by 2.6 kilos, and it also increased energy balance. So they were retaining more energy, body condition, with the brown midrib than the normal. Okay, so fiber digestibility was important for alfalfa, it was important for corn silage. We wanted to look at it even a different way by looking at a statistical analysis of what's been reported in the literature. And we looked at all the studies where they reported in NDF digestibility measured either in vitro or in situ, and we found that 1 unit increase in NDF digestibility resulted in 0.17 kilos of increase in dry matter intake and 0.25 kilos 4% fat-corrected milk. So about a third of a pound increase in dry matter intake and 0.55 pounds increase in fat-corrected milk. Okay, so let's go back to the range that we see for alfalfa and corn silage. We see easily a 20-unit range. Okay, so 20 units times 0.25 kilos would be 5 kilograms of milk, or about more than 11 pounds. Okay, so, and that's not something that we normally would use in formulating diets, but certainly has an impact on production. Now, something else we found from this study is that this applied within a forage family only. And when I talk about forage family, what I'm talking about is legumes versus grasses. So it was true within legumes, within grasses, but not across legumes and grasses. And the reason for that is that the fiber digestibility for grasses was quite a bit higher than legumes, but intake was lower. So grasses, we conclude that grasses are more filling than legumes. Okay, so that's not something that you would want to necessarily feed a more filling forage to a cow whose intake is limited by fill. Now, we've been investigating why grass fiber is more filling, and this is some recent results of one of my students, PhD student Kim Camus, and she reported this summer at our dairy science meetings, and she found that alfalfa NDF was more fragile than orchard grass NDF. That is, that it broke down more from chewing, okay? And she measured the rate of reduction of particles of alfalfa and orchard grass, of large to small in the rumen, and the rate of reduction was over 7% per hour for the alfalfa, but was between 4 and 5% per hour for the orchard grass. Okay, so then she measured the ruminating time of minutes per kilogram of forage NDF intake and found, well, it wasn't higher for alfalfa, it was actually slightly lower. So what that means is per chew, the alfalfa broke down faster than the orchard grass, and alfalfa particles pass faster. So that's probably why the grasses are more filling than legumes. Okay, the next important point, number 3, is that gut fill limits feed intake more as milk yield increases. So I want to show you a study that we did. We've done many of these type of studies where we take a group of cows, 32 cows in this case, and fed them 2 different treatments in a crossover design, so each cow gets each treatment. And we had a preliminary period where we fed an intermediate diet. In this case, the intermediate diet was 20% forage NDF and 28% starch. Okay. And the milk yield of the cows ranged from 22 to 60 kilos. So that's 40-something to 130 pounds a day. And then we gave them 2 different treatments in a different order, okay? But each cow got each one. One treatment was 16% forage NDF and almost 34% starch. The next was about 24% forage NDF and 23% starch, okay? So I'm going to show you what happened, what the response was for the cows in dry matter intake, and that's shown here. Along the x-axis here is the range in the milk yield of what they produced when they were receiving the intermediate diet between the 2. And on the y-axis here is the dry matter intake response of how much they ate of dry matter on the low forage diet minus the high forage diet. And what we see here is they were positive numbers. They were, the response ranged from close to 0 to 4.5 kilos a day, or about 10 pounds of dry matter. And the response was linear and positive in that as the milk yield of the cows increased, the dry matter intake response to the low forage diet increased. Okay. So what happened to milk yield? Well, there was a very sharp increase in milk yield among the highest yielding cows, those over about 100 pounds, 45 kilos. They had a very sharp increase. Okay. And at the top, the highest producing cows produced 10 kilos more fat-corrected milk. Okay. So that's 22 pounds more fat-corrected milk. Cows with production under 45 kilos or 100 pounds didn't respond at all in fat-corrected milk. If we look at feed efficiency, the marginal feed efficiency, the slope of this line of the fat-corrected milk response divided by the dry matter intake response is about 2.2 to 1. Okay, so that's a way of really increasing feed efficiency of the higher producing cows, is to feed them a lower forage NDF diet that is less filling. Because these cows, as production goes up, fill becomes more limiting and they respond more positively to a less filling diet. Okay, this study was done with brown midrib corn silage versus control corn silage. The brown midrib, it's the study I showed before. We showed an average response across cows, but what this shows is that the feed intake, or this shows is the production response to the brown midrib corn silage increased with milk yield. So the lowest producing cows had really no response to the brown midrib corn silage, but the response increased linearly with production, and cows up at 55 kilos or 120 pounds of milk increased 8 kilos, 8 or 9 kilos, or about 17 pounds of milk. So there's so when you feed them the fiber that clears from the rumen more quickly from the brown midrib, then they were able to eat more. And I didn't show that here, the dry matter intake response, but it looks the same as the fat-corrected milk yield response. And they were able to produce more milk. Then we did a study, Jen Volker-Linton as a PhD student, that looked at grasses versus legumes. She harvested orchard grass at 48% NDF, so excellent quality orchard grass, and compared that to alfalfa that was 43% NDF, and found that diet had no effect on feed intake averaged across cows, but cows with a greater drive to eat responded more positively to alfalfa over grass. And we can see that on the left graph here. This is the pretrial dry matter intake of what they ate when they were fed a mix of both diets. And on the y-axis is the dry matter intake response. Okay, of how much they ate of the alfalfa diet minus the grass. And we see that some cows, we have a negative response or a positive response. The cows with lower intake responded more positively to the grass, because when we subtracted the intake for the grass from the alfalfa, it was a negative number. So those, they may have been as low as 3 kilos lower dry matter intake for the alfalfa than the grass, but they responded more positively to the alfalfa compared to the grass as the drive to eat increased. So at the upper end, they consumed 4 kilos more of the alfalfa-based TMR than the grass-based TMR. And we think that the reason for that is because they could pass the alfalfa out faster than the grass. This is the rate of passage measured with on the alfalfa-based diet from the grass of the indigestible fiber fraction, and those cows with lower intake had the same passage rate. As we subtract one from the other, we get 0, but they were positive numbers, signifying that the response in passage to the alfalfa versus grass increased with intake. So they could, seems like they could push the alfalfa-based diet out faster from the rumen than the grass-based diet. There's something inhibiting passage from the grass, and likely what I already showed was probably particle size breakdown. Okay, the next topic is that feed intake is controlled by oxidation of fuels. And this is something new that's kind of evolved over the last 5 or 10 years. And the basis of it is that the liver here is connected to the brain by the vagus nerve called the hepatic vagus. Hepatic refers to the liver. And we know that from non-ruminant species, as the firing rate increases, that causes hunger and initiation of meals. And as the firing rate decreases of that nerve, that causes satiety in the end of meals. Okay, so again, hepatic oxidation theory is H stands for hepatic, O is oxidation, and T is theory. And it's basically that the feeding behavior is affected by the firing rate of the hepatic vagus nerve, as I just said, and the firing rate is affected by oxidation of fuels. With increased oxidation, when there's plentiful fuels, that decreases the firing rate, causing satiety in the end of meals. And with decreased oxidation, when there's fewer fuels, that increases the firing rate, causing hunger and initiation of meals. And it's important to know that there's great variation in the pattern of oxidation of fuels over the short term, even if the total amount of oxidation per day is constant. And feed intake is affected by the pattern of oxidation of fuels, which is under our control in diet formulation. So fuels oxidized in the ruminant liver include fatty acids, and fatty acids are continually supplied by mobilization of body reserves. There's continual lipogenesis, lipid production by adipose tissue, and lipolysis or lipid mobilization. Those lipids mobilize, get taken up by the liver and oxidized. Amino acids are a fuel that's oxidized. Lactate, either from the gut or from muscle. Glycerol from the breakdown of fatty acids, of triglycerides, and propionate. And propionate is a very important one because it's produced very quickly within the time frame of meals and can stimulate oxidation in the liver. What's not oxidized is glucose. That glucose is not taken up from the blood and oxidized, nor is acetate in ruminant liver. Okay. There's been quite a few studies that have infused propionate to investigate its effects on intake and feeding behavior. And relative to acetate, which is the most predominant fatty acid produced by rumen microbes in the rumen, is it will decrease not only feed intake, but total energy intake, accounting for the infusion. So, as I said, propionate is probably a very important fuel affecting intake because it's as a highly fermentable diets are consumed, particularly those with highly fermentable starch, there's very rapid production of propionate by microbes in the rumen, and that propionate gets rapidly absorbed and gets absorbed, goes to the liver, and is very highly extracted from the blood by the liver. And that's shown in this data from the UK, where this is the portal drain viscera flux of propionate, and it's very quickly absorbed into the portal, which goes to the liver from the gut within the time frame of meals. Okay. Most other fuels have a delay before most other fuels that can be oxidized in the liver or stimulate oxidation have a delay before getting to the liver, and they really can't affect the meal size. So this is some of our data that shows that highly fermentable diets cause satiety sooner. We compared high moisture corn to dry corn, and found that the high moisture corn resulted in lower dry matter intake than the dry corn by 1.7 kilos per day, and it reduced dry matter intake by reducing meal size about 20%, from 2.3 kilos to 1.9. And it was despite eating meals, this is the time between meals, the intermeal interval, they ate sooner, but not enough sooner to account for this large decrease in meal size. So dry matter intake was reduced. And there are many instances in the literature, reported in the literature, where feeding a more fermentable starch source will depress feed intake. And so the importance of this, it shows that it depresses intake by decreasing meal size. So it's something that happens within the time frame of a meal. So this is a model by which propionate oxidation may stimulate satiety. As the animal consumes feed, that increases propionate to the liver, and if the diet is more fermentable, then there's more propionate produced that goes to the liver. It gets rapidly taken up by the liver. That propionate is very important as a glucose precursor to produce glucose, which is required to produce milk lactose, which drives milk volume. Okay? So propionate is very important glucose precursor, and a much more inexpensive glucose precursor than using amino acids from protein. But that propionate can also be oxidized, and when it's oxidized, that can generate a satiety, that can stimulate satiety, decreasing feed intake. So for cows that have, the high-producing cows that have high glucose requirements, that really shifts so that propionate decreases intake less, because most of that propionate goes to glucose and isn't getting oxidized. But as glucose demand decreases through lactation, then propionate is oxidized sooner within the time frame of meals, and that can shorten the size of the meal. Okay. I'm going to shift a little bit to the transition period, going from pregnant to lactating. Well, we know that feed intake begins to decrease beginning up to 2 weeks prepartum. We can see here, about here, feed intake begins to decrease, and not for all cows, but there's a lot of cow-to-cow variability in this. Okay? Along with that, there's increased lipolysis, or fat mobilization, and the fatty acids in the blood increase, called non-esterified fatty acids. They increase about the same time. And if the fatty acids, if the fat mobilization is great enough, that can cause ketosis and fatty liver, because that fat can't all get oxidized, so it gets stored as triglycerides in the liver, and then the capacity of the liver to produce glucose is compromised. And that can suppress milk yield and feed intake. So the question is, going to the hepatic oxidation theory, is NEFA oxidation in the liver responsible? In many cases, the blood NEFA begins to rise in the weeks before calving, and this change corresponds with the pre-calving decline in feed intake. So as they mobilize more fat that gets taken up by the liver, we think that it's very likely that that fat gets oxidized, generating a satiety signal, kind of tricking the animal, even in early lactation, that when they're in negative energy balance, of kind of tricking their system to think there's plentiful fuels, because the liver is a sensor and there's plenty of fuel for the liver. Okay. Now, insulin is a major factor that influences fat mobilization, and this shows data for one cow for 24 hours, insulin in the green here, and NEFA, the fat from fat mobilized, in the blue. When insulin increases, then NEFA decreases in the blood, and when insulin decreases, NEFA increases, and this interplay goes on throughout the day. Okay? So there's a negative relationship between insulin and NEFA concentration in the blood. And what happens several weeks before calving is insulin decreases and NEFA begins to increase, and we think that that NEFA that gets taken up by the liver gets oxidized, depressing intake. Okay. So when fat is mobilized it's stored as triglycerides, it's mobilized as fatty acids, they can be oxidized in muscle. After they're lactating, they can be exported as triglycerides and milk fat, but much of it is either oxidized or is stored as triglycerides in the liver. Okay, so when we look at the depression of feed intake during the transition period, it starts with the decrease in plasma insulin. Okay? And also, the adipose tissue is more insulin resistant, so insulin sensitivity goes down, so that makes it even more likely to mobilize fat. So with the decrease in plasma insulin, there's increase in lipolysis, fat mobilization, decrease in lipogenesis. That increases the NEFA concentration in the blood. That NEFA gets taken up by the liver and oxidized, and that depresses intake. and that keeps plasma glucose down, which keeps plasma insulin down. So fatter cows are more, they have more adipose tissue to mobilize. They're more insulin resistant in general, so they may take longer to get through the cycle and come up on intake compared to thinner cows. So body condition score is very important for getting cows started on increasing intake and early lactation. Now, we think propionate is important through this as well, because propionate can increase oxidation, more complete oxidation of the NEFA that is taken up by the liver, and that can depress intake. So we have evidence that cows with higher NEFA and are more sensitive to more fermentable diets, okay, or to higher propionate. And also, there's a positive effect of propionate in that as we supply propionate, that may increase insulin and prevent more fat mobilization. So propionate really has dual effects in early lactation. So as I said, experimental infusion of propionate in early lactation decreased feed intake compared to acetate infusion, and this response was most dramatic in cows with high blood NEFA concentrations. But after 3 days of infusion, plasma NEFA concentration was decreased, so longer-term infusions might have less effect on feed intake by decreasing fat mobilization. Okay. So, you know, what does this mean? Well, I think that there's several reasons why we don't want to feed very highly fermentable starch to fresh cows, but we certainly need to learn more about just what the what the optimum starch fermentability is. Okay? I think it's very important to provide glucose precursors, but we want to avoid feeding highly fermentable starch, which decreases the size of meals. Okay. So the next important point to remember is that energy partitioning varies, and it varies through the lactation, obviously. Fresh cows are losing condition, and at peak lactation, more the cow's adipose tissue is fairly resistant to insulin, and insulin is low, and much of the energy gets partitioned to milk, and that's why feed efficiency, that is, if we look at fat-corrected milk per kilo of dry matter intake, then that's highest then. But as lactation progresses, adipose tissue gets more sensitive to insulin, and plasma glucose goes up, and insulin goes up, and more energy is partitioned to adipose tissue. But we can alter this relationship how we feed. So I'm going to show you a few examples of that. This is one of OBA's projects on feeding brown midrib corn silage in a high or low forage diet. The rations were formulated to either 29% NDF on the left or 38% NDF, and then we have brown midrib or control. And the goal of the 38% NDF is to feed no added corn grain. However, the control had a little bit higher fiber and lower starch, so we adjusted to have the same NDF concentration in the diet by feeding a little bit more corn grain. And then on the 29% added or NDF ration, we had 26 or 29% added corn grain. So overall, let's look at the effect of NDF. Okay, 29 versus 38. NDF affected, low NDF increased dry matter intake, okay, compared to higher NDF. But it did not affect milk yield. Okay? That extra energy from the higher starch diet went to body weight gain that we see here. Okay? Now, corn silage affected dry matter intake. That is, the brown midrib increased dry matter intake in either the high NDF or the low NDF diet. and increased milk yield in both the high and the low NDF diet. Yet it did not affect, increase energy partition to body weight gain. So it's very interesting to look at the middle two columns out of these four columns. That is the brown midrib with no added corn grain, where we increase energy intake by more digestible fiber compared to the control with 29% added corn grain, and we're increasing energy intake by fermentable starch. Dry matter intake was lower for the brown midrib because it was such a high forage diet. It was about a 65% forage diet compared to a 45 or so percent forage diet. And yet, fat-corrected milk was 1.5 kilos higher for the brown midrib than the control. So where did this extra energy go on the control with this 29% added corn grain? It didn't go to milk, it went to body weight gain. Okay, I think this is very important for feeding cows in late lactation to maintain body weight while still partitioning energy to milk. So by increasing energy intake with digestible fiber, we partitioned energy to milk. Okay? By increasing it with fermentable starch, we lost some milk, and energy was partitioned to body weight gain. This is some results of an experiment done in Iran where they substituted in beet pulp for barley grain in late lactation. They had 18 Holstein cows, and they conducted the experiment the last 2 months of lactation. And their treatments were 0% beet pulp, 8.6% beet pulp, or 17.2% beet pulp. And on the 0% beet pulp, they had 23.5% barley grain, and that went down to 6.3% barley grain. And we can see over here, here's 0, 8.6, and 17 on the data. Dry matter intake was not affected. Okay. Milk yield was not affected, but milk fat went up linearly with beet pulp addition. Milk energy output, MEO here, went up linearly with the beet pulp addition, and body condition score went down. That's units per period. Okay, they went down linearly, as did back fat thickness measured by ultrasound. So I think that this partitioning probably had something to do with the effect on insulin, which went down linearly. Remember that with higher insulin, the adipose tissue is going to compete with the mammary gland for fuels, so there'll be more partitioning to body condition score compared to lower insulin. And also ruminal pH increased linearly with addition of beet pulp for brewer's grain. Okay, the last example I have with energy partitioning is the effect of fat source. We conducted an experiment, this is Kevin Harvatine's master's thesis, conducted an experiment with different fat sources, and I'm going to show you the effect of the fat sources we had were saturated fatty acids, and they were saturated prill-free fatty acids, and that was Energy Booster 100. And then we wanted to compare that to the source of fatty acids we could have in the feed that was delivered the most unsaturated fat bypass the rumen, and that was Megalac R, and then we had a 50-50 mix. So when we look at what happened to dry matter intake declined from 25.7 kilos a day down to 24.1, okay? And 3.5% fat-corrected milk declined from 42.3 down to 37.0. And what happened is that with this decline in milk, then we saw an increase in energy partition to body weight gain. So from 0.11 kilos a day up to 0.94. So this basically what happened, we think, is the more unsaturated fat source got partially biohydrogenated, and we measured more CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, in the passing from the rumen, and that was taken up by the milk. We could detect it in the milk as well. And we know that the conjugated linoleic acid can decrease gene expression for fat synthesis in the mammary gland. But also, more recently, report from Kevin Harvatine working in Dale Bauman's lab found that this same CLA isomer increase gene expression for fat synthesis in adipose tissue, and that may be why there was an increase in body weight gain or partitioning. There was a decrease in milk fat produced, as well as fat-corrected milk, and increase in body weight gain. So this is something that we have to be careful of, feeding unsaturated fats in later lactation when we don't want them to gain condition. We compared a high moisture corn to dry corn, and found that there was little effect on production and overall, but a huge effect on production dependent upon fat-corrected milk yield. So, so fat-corrected milk ranged from about 25 kilos to over 55 kilos, and what we found is the high moisture corn depressed fat-corrected milk yield for the lower producing cows, but increased it for the higher producing cows. So depressed it as much as about 7 kilos, or over 15 pounds a day, for the lower producing cows, and there was a linear positive response as fat-corrected milk yield increased. So total different response for high and low producing cows with high moisture corn, something as simple as high moisture corn versus dry corn. Okay, so that brings us to our first question: is how do we use this information? And the question is I guess the first poll is, what milking cow rations do you have on your farm? Do you feed the same ration to all cows? No fresh cow ration, 2 milking cow rations, a fresh cow ration, 1 milking cow ration, fresh cow ration, 2 milking cow rations, or a fresh cow ration and more than 2 milking cow rations. Okay, so we'll keep the poll open.
And we're off and running here, you Republicans. Now you got to be voting. You should be voting now. You got 30 seconds, maybe 25. Time's going to be tight here. So we're off and running at this stage of the game, and we've got about 41% of the people voted. Some straggling Democrats coming in right now at this stage of the game. Mike, can you see the vote? Are you seeing the vote?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. We're slowing down here. We're slowing down. We're not giving much more time.
Only 63% voted.
We're moving on. We're moving on. I think Jim is going to close it right now. So we're closing the vote. And Mike, you might want to read the results back because they can't see it.
All right. So the greatest was number 4 with 43%, a fresh cow ration and 2 milking cow rations. Okay. Followed by a fresh cow ration and 1 milking cow ration, and then the rest were about the same. No fresh, well, we have no fresh cow ration, 2 milking cow ration at 14%, same ration to all cows, and then fresh and more than 2 milking cow rations was 10%. So if we take 4 and 5 together, then we've got 53%, and that's good because how do we use this information? We really can't use it if we feed the same ration to all cows, because cows vary in their response to diets through lactation. So you can't really optimize it for all cows. Okay, so the reason for that is that physiological states of lactating cows varies. The fresh cow has low insulin concentration, they're insulin resistant, they're mobilizing fat, they have higher NEFA and ketones, early to mid lactation. They have high glucose demand. They're low NEFA and ketones. The satiety signals are low. And distension begins to limit feed intake. In late lactation, glucose demand is decreased. Insulin is elevated, insulin sensitivity is increased, they have low NEFA, they're sensitive to milk fat depression, they're sensitive to energy partitioning to body reserves. So, you know, we really can't feed optimally one diet to all of this, to cows as they progress through lactation. So transition diet recommendations are that the goal is to decrease NEFA and maintain ruminal fill. So, you know, ruminal fill is very important because it provides energy if and when intake drops at calving. It provides buffering, decreasing risk of acidosis, and it provides distension, decreasing the risk of displaced abomasum. So it's we want to feed to keep the rumen full as long as fill isn't limiting intake. And during this period, the liver's getting sorted out and other things. Intake is affected metabolically and not by fill. So we want to feed a fiber with a long ruminal retention time, such as grass hay or haylage, and not finely chopped forages and not a lot of high fiber byproducts that can pass from the rumen very quickly. We want to target moderate starch fermentability to supply adequate propionate without very rapid production within a meal that shuts down the meal.
Mike, we want to make sure we allow a little time for a couple of questions here at the end and some discussion. So if you can kind of wrap this up.
We're going to go fast. Yep.
Okay.
So the next poll is how long should cows receive the fresh ration? Now, if you don't have your own farm, that's fine. Just how long do you think they should receive the fresh cow ration? 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or longer?
And we're up to almost 50% here. We're voting quicker here now. We're voting quicker
Voting quicker,
at this point.
Right?
I think we're going to close it off right now and show the people.
Okay, so 50% for 3 weeks, okay, and we have 26% for 2 weeks, 20% for 4 weeks, and then 2% for 1 week and longer than 4 weeks. So, okay, so basically, ideally, you want to change to the peak lactation diet when plasma NEFA and ketones decrease and intake is steadily increasing. So practically, cows with steadily rising feed intake and milk yield may be ready to shift diets as early as 7 days in milk or as late as 21 days in milk. So I think often cows are kept in the fresh group too long. It's they're in this period for a fairly short period of time. Possibly a cow with higher body condition score is going to take longer to get started, but often they can be shifted 10 days to 2 weeks. But it really is an individual cow basis. So at peak lactation, the goal is to provide low-fill, highly fermentable diets to maximize energy intake and microbial protein production while maintaining ruminal pH. And feed intake is limited primarily by rumen fill. They respond well to highly fermentable diets. They partition little energy to body condition. You want to use highly fermentable starch sources. This is where high moisture corn works well. And use low lignin corn silage, such as BMR corn silage, alfalfa, and reduce the use of perennial grasses that are more filling. And the last question is, when do you change to a lower energy ration?
Okay, we're off and running. Here's your last chance to vote now.
Milk yield, based on milk yield, days in milk, body condition score, or a combination of days in milk and milk yield, or body condition score and milk yield.
Oh, I got my favorite one picked out at this stage of the game. By the way, Mike, do you have your right answer here? I assume you have a right answer,
I have
right?
my preferences, right? It's I have a preference.
And we are at 87. Let's close this off and show them what we got.
Okay, so it was basically the highest was body condition score and milk yield, and I'm pleased to see that, followed by days in milk and milk yield. Well, body condition score and milk yield was 43%, days in milk and milk yield was 30%, body condition score was 11, days in milk was 11, and milk yield only was 4%. And it's very important to use body condition score, I think, as the major factor, possibly modified by milk yield. And the reason why is because of the health problems with excessive body condition score at parturition. This is the time that in late lactation is when we have a chance of really narrowing the gap in body condition score among cows at dry off and at freshening. So excessive body condition score can result in fatty liver, ketosis, DAs, reproductive failure, and I think we want to change to a maintenance diet at a body condition score of 3. Okay? And in the optimum is going to be subject to further research, I think, but I think it's lower than what we've talked about in the past. So then how do we do this? We switch at 3, and we want to prevent them from gaining any more condition. And just the last slide or so is we want to feed a maintenance diet, and the goal is to maintain body condition score while maintaining or even potentially increasing yield of milk and milk fat. Okay? So what is a maintenance diet? You want to avoid highly fermentable diets. These cows are insulin sensitive. They're partitioning energy to adipose tissue, more sensitive to milk fat depression, and you get more partitioning of energy to adipose tissue, we think, then. They have lower glucose requirements. You want to dilute starch. The reason they're increasing body condition is their plasma glucose is going up. That triggers insulin, and we want to, they don't need all the starch that they're getting. So we can dilute starch by using high fiber byproducts, okay? And we want to use less fermentable starch sources like dry ground and not high moisture corn. We want to limit fat, especially unsaturated fat that can cause milk fat depression and partition more energy to body weight. And here, the forage would be grass or low lignin corn silage. We want to replace the starch with digestible fiber, either from the forage or from high fiber byproducts. So in conclusion, feed intake is affected by forage NDF concentration and digestion characteristics, fermentability of diets, and the type and amount of fat. And factors controlling feed intake and energy partitioning vary throughout lactation, and milk yield and cow health can be improved by feeding different diets through lactation. Okay, so with that, we'll take questions.
We have several questions here that we can look at this point. Let's slip down to number 3 question because we just talked about it. The most important thing then is to maintain body condition stability. Is that right? Is that a take-home message?
Yes, I think it's very important to use our feeding management in late lactation to minimize differences among cows and hit a target body condition score. Okay, and the only way to really do that is by moving on body condition and using a maintenance diet to partition energy to milk rather than body condition.
Mike, can you push the last slide forward so we can be viewing that as we finish up with some more questions, since you're the driver at this stage of the game?
And Mike, before we go on just a little bit further here, we will keep everybody together that wants to stay together here for some more questions and discussion. But since we're right at the end of our publicized hour anyway, Mike, I want to thank you very much for your nice presentation today. Very well done. And just to remind folks, if they have to leave us soon here, that our next webinar will be on December 12th. Again, that's the second Monday of the month at noon Central Time, where our presenter will be Jim Barmore, a consultant with GPS Consulting. That webinar is going to be sponsored by Kuhn North America, and we're looking forward to that. And now we can take some more questions, Mike, as long as people want to stay on. We still have quite a number of folks tuning in, so go ahead.
Very good. Here's another one. What would happen to a dry cow eating limited quantity of a high-quality forage to prevent metabolic problems, bulking up the ration to maintain room and fill? Mike, risks there?
Well, yeah, I think, a problem with that is that it's very. I think that a lot of problems can be avoided if the rumen is full all the time throughout lactation. Okay, we run into problems when we have limited rumen fill. Now, this is never a problem at peak lactation because fill is limiting intake. But with fresh cows, if they have much less digesta in the rumen, they're going to be more prone or higher risk for DAs, but also higher risk for acidosis because there's tremendous buffer capacity in rumen digesta. And with a restricting feed with a higher quality forage, then we're going to have much less buffer capacity and distension in the rumen.
Mike, can a cow eat enough finely chopped, high-quality silage to have good rumen fill, or is it impossible?
Well, I suppose it depends on how finely chopped, but certainly they can consume high or high percent of the diet as finely chopped if we have a complementary forage in with it with long particles to retain those small particles in the rumen. Okay, but if we just finely chop it, then I think they're going to have lower digesta volume, and they're going to have poor feed efficiency because it's going to be passing too fast.
Mike, another question. This individual has ability to feed a separate top dress supplement to his fresh cows. How would you suggest formulating that? And he lists a whole bunch of feeds. I won't read them through them. I think you can see them. Any general guidelines on that top dress for fresh cows?
Top dress for fresh cows compared. So I'm assuming that it's a one group TMR with the ability to supplement just the fresh cows. Is that?
Yeah, let's make believe that he cannot have a fresh cow diet. So
right.
The only way you're going to help the fresh cow out is on this top dress.
Well, I would say it might be the other way around, is to have a base diet for the fresh cows in the maintenance group and to top dress the high cows, because you can't take away, you can only add, and the fresh cows need higher fiber. I guess you could top dress with more forage, but you need to make sure that it's providing the correct nutrients.
So he came back in very quickly and said it would only be in the parlor, so feeding forages would not be an alternative.
No, that's not, yeah. No. It would be better to feed a base mix than to feed in the parlor grain related to milk production of the cows, of the high cows.
Let's go back to one of your earlier slides, Mike. It says, what determines how much propionate is going to be used for gluconeogenesis versus how much gets oxidized by the liver? What controls that switch, or is there?
Okay. Well, it has to do, well, there's two things. That's going to change. It's going to be variable for all cows, okay? And it's going to be affected within a cow across lactation, depending upon insulin concentration, because with higher insulin, as plasma glucose goes up and insulin goes up, then that will downregulate genes for gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis gets downregulated as insulin goes up through lactation, okay? And also, it has to do with how quickly the propionate is getting produced and entering the liver. If the pathways for gluconeogenesis are set for any particular cow or any particular point in time, and the propionate comes in much more quickly than it can get used, some of that propionate is likely to get oxidized or stimulate oxidation.
Another question, do you recommend feeding bypass fat prepartum to cows?
I don't recommend it because I need to, when I recommend things, I need to have a good reason for it. I'm I'm very interested in the physiological effects of different fatty acids, and that's something that I'm currently investigating, but I'm not at a point where I would. I've seen enough convincing evidence to recommend feeding it there or to fresh cows.
A related question has, since unsaturated fats or oils have more effect on body condition score rather than milk production, would it be better to feed saturated fats just for in the production ration? I think there's somewhat, those two might be related, those last two questions.
Yeah, I think that unsaturated fats don't necessarily go to body condition. I showed that slide really to show that that could, if that unsaturated fat gets biohydrogenated, because these biohydrogenation products not only affect fat synthesis in the mammary gland, but they also affect fat synthesis in adipose tissue. So I wanted to show an example of that. But certainly there are instances where you could feed unsaturated fat and they result in increased milk production. It's just that we're trying to sort this out in general. So late lactation is where I think I would stay away from higher unsaturated fat, because we're trying to feed a maintenance diet, and we don't want them to be partitioning energy to body weight because of these biohydrogenation products.
Well, we have another quick question, and we'll let you off the hot seat here in just a few minutes. We're almost keeping up, Mike. So high-producing cows have more feed efficiency, improved feed efficiency, because they digest the forage NDF better. Is that right?
No, high-producing cows have higher feed efficiency because they're directing the nutrients to milk. They have they have lower insulin. And so the adipose tissue is competing less for fuels with the mammary gland. But as lactation progresses, okay, the plasma glucose starts increasing as milk production declines, and insulin goes up, and then they are partitioning more energy to body weight, so at the expense of milk.
Quick question on comparison of orchard grass versus ryegrass as far as NDF levels and maybe even NDF digestibilities. Comments?
No, it's something I'm very interested in, though. I've gotten this question several times. It's something that I'd like to investigate, but I haven't seen any comparisons as far as effects on intake. So.
Okay.
So it's a question I get a lot, and it's in the queue of stuff to investigate.
Is it really possible to manage 5 different rations, 2 dry cow, 3 lactating rations with farms that have small number of cows, like 100 or 200 cows? From a practical view, what should he do?
Okay, I mean that's another often asked question, and certainly it's easier with as farm size increases, but there's a lot of there's compromises that you make as you have fewer diets. I think it's important to recognize what they are and think of ways that you may be able to supplement, such as top dressing grain or feeding grain in the parlor to the high cows, having a base diet. If you have to have only 2 diets for lactating cows, then should it be the fresh and the late lactation have the same diet, and the high group have a hotter diet? All right, so there's applying this information is going to be different on every farm.
These 2 questions wrap together, Mike. A saturated fat or source, how many grams would you feed to fresh cows, 21 to 150 days of milk, and then late lactation cows? Any guidelines on level of saturated fatty acids or fats being fed?
No, I don't. I haven't seen good evidence for feeding any fat source to fresh cows because they're already in a situation where they've got excessive fat that's getting oxidized, we think, in the liver and in limiting intake. As we know more about specific physiological effects of fatty acids, I think I'll probably revise that. But you know, as far as response to fat addition, I think it's very farm specific and diet specific and stage of lactation specific. So it's not something I would really want to feed to a maintenance group. It's something I may try to a maintenance group, but if we're not seeing the response in milk yield, I don't want the response to be in body condition. So.
And here's your last question, and this will be your last one, Mike. We thank you for your extra time here today. What about gluconeogenic capacity in the liver, such as enzymes and that? Do high-producing cows have greater capacity to produce glucose?
Okay. Well, you know, gluconeogenic capacity is, well, first of all, I don't know of any literature, any study in the literature that has looked across cows with different genetic capacity and enzymes for gluconeogenesis. So I can't say for sure, but gluconeogenic capacity is certainly higher at peak lactation than late lactation. It's just that hormones like glucagon and insulin affect the glucogenic capacity. All right, and they change through lactation.
Well, Dr. Mike Allen, thank you very much for going beyond the call of duty here today. We still had 40-plus people listening to all your answers, so that's always a good testimony that there's interest out there. Again, our thanks to Steve Larson and the crew at Fort Atkinson for setting up this webinar here. Again, thanks to Mike Allen, Michigan State. Steve, any last words you want to end up with?
Just another round of thank you so much to Mike Allen for an excellent job. Very interesting, good participation, and with our participants today. Stayed with us very well. We thank you very much. Also, we always thank you, Mike, for your work down there at the University of Illinois as being a part of our webinar series. And just another reminder that we're going to be looking at some economics on our next webinar, December 12th. Jim Barmore of GPS Consulting will be talking about some of the big dollar herd decisions that we all have to make out on our farms and our clients' farms, and that's going to be sponsored by Kuhn North America. So we look forward to having you all with us on December 12th, and we thank you for your participation today.